What if the system meant to protect you was the one hunting you down? What if the truth was so dangerous that those in power would do anything to bury it? One man stood against corruption. But what he uncovered was bigger than he ever imagined, and far more deadly. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subs. Your support keeps us going and allows us to create even more gripping content. The evening hum of torques filled the air, blending the sounds of clinking glasses, muffled conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter from the far end of the dining area. The restaurant, nestled in the heart of Los Angeles, was always alive at this hour. It was a place where Hollywood elites and working-class folks dined under the same soft glow of warm pendant lights, sharing meals that had been carefully curated over the years. Vin Diesel sat at the bar, dressed simply in a dark hoodie and jeans, blending in as much as his presence allowed. He had always preferred it this way. No grand entrance, no special treatment. This was his way of understanding the heartbeat of his own establishment, reading the subtle cues of his employees and patrons alike. A restaurant was more than a business, it was an ecosystem. And he had long learned that numbers on a spreadsheet never told the full story. The bartender, Nate, a sharp-eyed young man with a knack for mixing drinks and reading people, placed a glass of water in front of him. "Slow night or busy?" Vin asked casually. Nate wiped his hands on a towel and glanced at the room. "Steady." Kitchens slammed, but nothing unusual. Vin nodded, letting his gaze sweep across the restaurant. At first, everything seemed normal. Waiters moving swiftly between tables, couples engaged in quiet conversations, the rhythmic clang of plates being set down. But then, something caught his attention. Near the entrance, a man in a crisp navy blue shirt stood with his arms folded, surveying the room with an intensity that felt out of place. His posture was too rigid, his eyes too focused. He wasn't a customer waiting for a table or someone searching for a friend. He was watching, studying. Vin had seen enough people in his life to recognize a cop the moment he laid eyes on one. Even out of uniform, they had a way of carrying themselves, shoulders squared, presence heavy, and this one wasn't just passing through. Rick Holloway. The name clicked in Vin's memory a second later. A longtime LAPD officer, known for being relentless, but not in a good way. There had been murmurs about him in the past, allegations of harassment, of flexing his authority on those who couldn't fight back. But, like many things in this city, those complaints had been swept aside, buried under bureaucracy and silence. Vin watched as Holloway's gaze settled on a young waitress moving between tables, a black apron tied around her waist. She was avoiding his eyes, deliberately keeping her distance. Emily Carter. She had been working at Torques for over a year now, punctual, hardworking, never one to stir trouble. But right now, her hands seemed unsteady as she set down a tray. She kept her head down, eyes fixed on her task, yet her body language screamed discomfort. Something was off. Vin sat up a little straighter, instinctively tuning in. Holloway took a slow step forward. Emily stiffened. Her hand hovered for a second too long as she placed a drink in front of a customer. And then she quickly turned on her heel, making a beeline toward the back hallway leading to the kitchen. Vin's gut tightened. "Who's that guy?" he asked, nodding subtly in Holloway's direction. Nate followed his line of sight and frowned. "That's Holloway. Cops come through sometimes, but that one? He gives off bad vibes." Vin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched as Emily disappeared through the door to the back. Holloway lingered for a moment before following, slipping past a group of incoming customers with quiet precision. A cold sense of unease settled in Vin's chest. He wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions, but he knew how to trust his instincts. And right now, everything in him was telling him that something wasn't right. He stood, pushing his glass of water aside. "Cover for me," he muttered to Nate before making his way toward the back. The moment he stepped into the hallway, he heard it, a soft, muffled sob. "Emily." The sound of muffled sobs grew louder as Vin moved further down the hallway. The ambient noise from the dining area faded, replaced by the sharp edge of tension in the air. He rounded the corner and saw Emily, her back pressed against the stainless steel counter, her hands gripping the edges as if steadying herself. standing in front of her. Rick Holloway loomed, his stance rigid, his gaze sharp and unyielding. He wasn't yelling, but his voice carried a weight that made the space feel smaller. "You're not answering my question," Holloway said, his tone even, but laced with something unmistakably threatening. Emily shook her head, her breath uneven. "I already told you. I don't know what you're talking about. I've been here all night." Holloway took a slow step forward. "That's so? Funny thing is, we got a report about some suspicious activity involving one of the employees here. And wouldn't you know it, your name came up." Vin watched as Emily's fingers clenched tighter around the metal surface. Her knuckles turned white. "Please," she whispered, almost too softly to hear. "I don't understand what's happening." That was enough. Vin stepped forward, making his presence known. "That makes two of us." Holloway turned his head slightly, his expression impassive as he took in Vin. There was no flicker of recognition, no sign of intimidation, just the calm, detached look of a man who had spent years believing no one could challenge him. "This is a private conversation," Holloway said. "Not anymore," Vin replied, his voice firm but measured. He glanced at Emily, who was clearly shaken but trying to hold herself together. "You okay?" Emily hesitated, then nodded quickly, too quickly. Holloway exhaled through his nose. "Unimpressed. This doesn't concern you." Vin crossed his arms, his stance widening slightly. "See, that's where you're wrong. Emily works for me. This is my restaurant, so if someone's making my employee cry, that sure as hell concerns me." A flicker of amusement crossed Holloway's face, like he'd just heard a naive remark from a child. "I'm just asking a few questions." "That's not what it looks like." Holloway tilted his head, studying Vin with the kind of detached curiosity reserved for people he didn't consider a threat. "I know who you are. Big-time actor, tough guy on the big screen." He let the words sit in the air before adding, "But this is real life." Vin didn't blink. "Which means you need a real reason to be here." Holloway's smirk barely faded. "Like I said, we received a tip, something about illegal activity tied to one of your employees." "That's so?" Vin's voice remained level, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath it. "Then where's your warrant?" Holloway's expression darkened slightly. "I don't need a warrant to ask a few questions." "No," Vin agreed, "but you do need one to harass my staff." A muscle in Holloway's jaw twitched. Vin took another step forward, making it clear he wasn't backing down. "So unless you've got something official, I suggest you leave, now." For a moment, the tension stretched tight between them. Emily held her breath. The hallway felt stifling, every second dragging out like a slow pull of a trigger. Then, just like that, Holloway took a step back. His expression didn't shift, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating. "All right," he said casually, like he had never intended to stay long in the first place. "Guess I'll be on my way." Vin didn't move, watching him closely. Holloway turned slightly as he walked past, then paused just enough to murmur, just for Vin to hear, "I'll be back, and next time, you won't be able to protect anyone." Then he was gone. Emily let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging. Vin clenched his jaw, his mind already working. This wasn't over. The next morning, the city was just beginning to stir. Sunlight crept through the blinds of Emily Carter's small apartment, casting thin golden streaks across the floor. She sat at the edge of her bed, her phone in her trembling hands. The screen displayed a message that made her stomach tighten. "You think you can get away that easily?" Attached was a grainy photo of her, taken from a distance, through the front window of Torx. She was mid-shift, balancing a tray, her expression neutral, but the meaning was clear. Someone was watching. Her heart pounded as she reread the words. It could have been a prank, maybe some cruel joke, but after last night, she knew better. For a long moment, she just sat there, breathing carefully, willing her pulse to slow. Then, with stiff fingers, she tapped out a response to Vin Diesel. "We need to talk." By the time she arrived at Torx for her shift, the morning rush had begun to build. Sunlight spilled through the large front windows, illuminating the polished floors and the gleaming silverware set neatly on each table. The restaurant was a sanctuary during the day, a place of order and quiet efficiency. But to Emily, the walls felt tighter than usual, as if the whole building was holding its breath. She pushed through the kitchen doors, finding Vin at his usual spot near the prep station, talking with the head chef about the day's deliveries. His expression was unreadable, but the moment he saw her, he set his clipboard down. "You okay?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "I got a message this morning. Someone's watching me." Vin didn't react right away. He reached for her phone. Studying the image, his jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "This came from an unknown number?" She nodded. He handed the phone back, then exhaled through his nose. Slow and deliberate. "All right, we're handling this." Emily swallowed hard. "It's Holloway, isn't it?" Vin didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. The lunch crowd arrived on schedule. And for a while, everything ran smoothly. But midway through the shift, just as Emily was setting down a plate at a corner booth, she felt it. A sensation prickling at the back of her neck. The unmistakable weight of being watched. She turned her head, and there he was. Rick Holloway sat at the bar, dressed in civilian clothes. No badge, no uniform, just a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, as if he were just another patron enjoying a meal. Except he wasn't. His gaze was fixed on her. Emily's breath caught, but she forced herself to keep moving. Vin noticed immediately. He watched Holloway from across the room. His expression unreadable, but there was a shift in his stance. The slight clenching of his hands. A moment later, Holloway raised a finger, signaling the bartender. Nate hesitated before stepping over. His movements stiff. "I'll take a whiskey," Holloway said, his tone casual. "Neat." Then he turned his head, locking eyes with Emily. "Actually," he added, "have her bring it over." Silence stretched between them. Nate shot a glance at Vin, who gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. But before Nate could respond, Emily stiffened and moved toward the bar. She had spent too long being afraid. If she avoided him now, it would only confirm what he wanted, that he had power here. She set the drink down in front of him, keeping her face blank. "Anything else?" Holloway tilted his head slightly, studying her. Then he smiled, slow and deliberate. "No," he said, "this will do just fine." His fingers brushed against the glass, but he didn't lift it right away. "You know," he mused, almost conversationally, "I was reading about your boss last night. He's got an interesting past. Some close calls. Some, let's call them questionable choices." Emily's stomach twisted, but she didn't respond. Holloway's smile widened. "Makes you wonder if he's really the kind of man who can protect people like you." Before she could answer, Vin appeared beside her. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Holloway turned his gaze to him, his expression unreadable. Then, after a beat, he chuckled. "Just having a drink," he said. "That's not a crime, is it?" Vin's stare didn't waver. "No, but harassment is." Holloway lifted his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Diesel. I'm just here for the ambiance." Vin took a slow step forward, positioning himself between Holloway and Emily. "Then enjoy it somewhere else." A long, tense silence stretched between them. Then, just as smoothly as he had arrived, Holloway pushed his glass away and stood. "I'll be back," he said, adjusting his sleeves. He turned to Vin, lowering his voice just enough that only he could hear. "And next time, you won't see me coming." Then he strolled out, whistling a quiet tune under his breath. Vin didn't move until the door shut behind him. Then he exhaled, his fingers flexing at his sides. Emily looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Vin's gaze drifted toward the security cameras mounted near the ceiling. "We start watching back," he said. Later that night, when the restaurant was closed and the last of the staff had gone home, Vin sat in his office, scrolling through hours of security footage. Most of it was the usual. Servers moving between tables, customers coming and going. Then, just past midnight, he saw it. A man standing just outside Torque's, half hidden in the shadows, watching. The next day started like any other. The mid-morning rush had come and gone, leaving the restaurant in a quiet lull before the lunch crowd trickled in. Sunlight streamed through the windows, reflecting off polished countertops and neatly arranged silverware. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air as staff moved efficiently. resetting tables and preparing for the next wave of customers. Then, the doors swung open, not with the casual ease of a customer arriving, but with an air of authority that sent a ripple of unease through the room. Two uniformed health inspectors strode in, their expressions unreadable. Behind them, a man in a tan suit followed, clipboard in hand. His gaze swept the restaurant like a predator surveying its territory. Vin Diesel, who had been reviewing invoices near the bar, immediately picked up on the shift in energy. He set his papers down and walked over as the man in the suit approached the hostess stand. "Morning," Vin greeted evenly, his tone neutral but firm. "What can I do for you?" The man barely looked up from his clipboard. "Health inspection," he said, flipping a page. "Routine check." Vin didn't buy that for a second. Health inspections were scheduled, not sprung on a place like this in the middle of business hours. He crossed his arms. "We had our last inspection 3 months ago. Everything passed." The man finally looked up, offering a thin smile. "New directives from the department. Random spot checks. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." Vin didn't believe in coincidences. And this reeked of something deliberate. He glanced toward the inspectors, who were already moving through the kitchen, opening refrigerators, peering under countertops. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, sensing something wasn't right. Then, from the back, a voice called out, "We got an issue here." Vin turned as one of the inspectors gestured toward a shelf near the prep station. He was pointing at a single, unopened container of produce. "This was supposed to be discarded," the inspector said, shaking his head. "That's a violation." Vin's brows pulled together. "That was just delivered this morning. It hasn't even been opened yet." The inspector ignored him, scribbling something on his notepad. "Multiple infractions like this, and we're looking at a temporary closure until things get sorted." The room went still. Nate, standing behind the bar, muttered under his breath, "You've gotta be kidding me." But Vin already knew the game. This wasn't about health and safety. This was pressure, calculated, intentional, a move to disrupt his business. And he had a good idea who was behind it. The man in the tan suit clicked his pen shut. "Look, Mr. Diesel, we can make this easy. Fix these issues, and you'll be up and running again soon. But as of now, Torx is temporarily closed until further notice." A muscle in Vin's jaw ticked, but he kept his composure. "And who exactly do you report to?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll find all that information in the paperwork we'll be sending over." With that, they turned and left, leaving behind a stunned silence. Emily stood frozen near the server station, her hands gripping the counter. "This is because of me," she whispered. Vin looked at her sharply. "No, it's not." Her eyes were wide with guilt. "If I hadn't," he cut her off. "This was going to happen either way. Holloway isn't after you. He's after control. This is how he plays." Emily swallowed hard, but she didn't look convinced. "I should go," she said quietly. Vin frowned. "Go where?" She took a shaky breath. "If I leave, maybe this stops. Maybe he backs off." Vin leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "That's not how this works. You think if you walk away, he's done? He'll just find someone else. And next time, maybe they won't have someone looking out for them." Emily hesitated, her fingers twisting together. Vin exhaled. "I know this is terrifying. But you're not alone in this." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then finally nodded, her shoulders slumping slightly in relief. But Vin knew words weren't enough. He needed action. That afternoon, he made a call. An hour later, he sat across from Olivia Morgan in her downtown office, the sounds of the city filtering through the large glass windows behind her. She was sharp, confident, and well known in legal circles for taking on cases that others avoided. After hearing everything, she leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against a notepad. "This isn't just a harassment case," she said. "This is systemic. If Holloway is using his influence to shut down businesses, he's done it before. And if he's targeting Emily, she's not his first victim." Vin folded his arms. "So what do we do?" Olivia studied him for a moment. "We dig. We find out who else he's done this to. And we build a case." Vin nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then let's get started." Later that night, as he reviewed old records and reports Olivia had pulled, a particular name caught his attention. 5 years ago, a former restaurant worker, harassed, intimidated, filed a complaint against Holloway. Case dismissed. Vin stared at the screen, his fingers tightening around the mouse. This had happened before, and this time, he wasn't going to let it happen again. The air inside Vin Diesel's office at Torx felt heavier than usual. His desk was cluttered with reports Olivia had pulled. Records of past complaints against Rick Holloway, most of them buried under bureaucratic red tape. 5 years ago, a former restaurant worker had filed a harassment claim against Holloway. The case never made it past an internal review. There were others, too, different names, same pattern, but no one had ever made it stick. Vin tapped a pen against the desk, his jaw tight. He'd spent years in an industry where perception was everything, where the truth could be twisted into whatever narrative someone wanted to sell. He knew what was coming before it happened. That afternoon, his phone buzzed with a notification. A headline flashed across the screen. Hollywood icon Vin Diesel linked to criminal syndicate. He clicked the link, already knowing what he'd find. An article filled with vague accusations. Grainy photos from years ago, taken out of context. A supposed source claimed Vin had ties to known criminals in Los Angeles. That his restaurant was a front for something bigger. Fabricated, every word. The timing was too perfect. His phone buzzed again, this time. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "You're being set up," a voice said without introduction. Vin frowned. "Who is this?" "Jason Lee. I'm a journalist. I've been following Holloway for a while now." There was a brief pause. "I need to talk to you in person." Vin glanced at the article still open on his screen. "You know who's behind this?" Jason's voice was steady. "I know more than you think. But if we're going to stop this, you need to move fast." Vin exhaled. He didn't like walking into things blind. But something about Jason's tone told him he wasn't bluffing. "Where?" Jason gave him a location. An old diner on the outskirts of downtown. 1 hour. That night, after closing up Torx, Vin stepped outside into the cool Los Angeles air. The streets were quiet, the usual late-night buzz of the city settling into its slower rhythm. He didn't notice it at first. The dark sedan parked a little too perfectly across the street. Not until he started walking toward his car and saw the headlights flicker on. The engine hummed as the vehicle pulled onto the street, creeping forward as he drove off. Vin's grip on the wheel tightened. He made a left onto a quieter road, then another, weaving through the city's grid. The sedan matched every turn. He tested it, speeding up slightly. So did they. This wasn't paranoia. He was being followed. His pulse steady. He took a hard right into an alleyway, cutting through a narrow street he knew well. For a moment, the headlights disappeared. He pressed down on the gas, trying to put more distance between them. Then, just as he reached the next intersection, flashing red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror. A patrol car. His stomach sank. He slowed to a stop, watching as the sedan disappeared into the distance. The squad car pulled in behind him, and when he glanced in the side mirror, he saw 2 officers stepping out. One of them was Holloway. Vin clenched his jaw. Of course. The other cop, younger, approached the driver's side, tapping on the window. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer said. Vin rolled the window down slightly. "Everything all right, officer?" "License and registration." Vin didn't move. "I wasn't speeding. I didn't run a light. So why exactly am I being pulled over?" The younger cop didn't answer. Holloway stepped closer, a slow smirk creeping onto his face. "Just a routine stop," he said. "We like to check in on guys like you." Vin met his eyes, refusing to look away. "Guys like me?" Holloway leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Vin could hear. "Actors who think they're untouchable. You may play the hero in your movies, Diesel, but out here, you're nothing." Vin forced himself to stay calm. He knew Holloway wanted him to react. He wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. "Search the vehicle," Holloway said to the younger cop. The officer hesitated. "Sir, we don't have." Holloway cut him off with a look. "Do it." Vin exhaled slowly. He knew what was coming before it happened. The younger officer opened the passenger door, reaching under the seat. For a second, his movements were stiff, unsure. Then his hand emerged, gripping a small plastic bag filled with a white powdery substance. The cop froze. His face paled slightly. Holloway, on the other hand, smiled. Well, he said, loud enough for effect. What do we have here? Vin stared at the bag. His pulse didn't spike. His expression didn't change. He had been around long enough to know when a script was being played out in real time. The younger officer turned to Holloway. His voice uncertain. It was under the seat. Holloway sighed dramatically, shaking his head. That's a real shame. Then, meeting Vin's gaze, he added, looks like you're in some serious trouble. Vin didn't say a word. Holloway grinned, stepping back. Cuff him. The cold bite of metal snapped tight around Vin Diesel's wrists. He didn't resist as the younger officer hesitated before locking the handcuffs in place. Holloway, standing just a few feet away, watched with an expression of smug satisfaction. You're not a movie star here, Diesel, Holloway said, voice low and full of amusement. Out here, I'm the one writing the script. Vin met his eyes but didn't react. He knew how this worked. He had seen it before. The way a corrupt system operated. How men like Holloway used power to silence those who stood in their way. If he so much as tensed the wrong way, it would be twisted against him. The younger officer, clearly uncomfortable, guided him toward the patrol car. Vin caught the flicker of uncertainty in the kid's eyes. The way his grip wasn't as firm as it should have been. He wasn't fully on board with this. But he wasn't going to defy Holloway either. The door slammed shut behind Vin, and through the glass, he saw Holloway leaning against the hood, watching him like a man who had just won a bet. The drive to the station was silent, the weight of the situation settling in Vin's chest. He wasn't worried about the false charges. Olivia would handle that. What concerned him was the bigger picture. This wasn't about making an arrest. This was about sending a message. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere shifted. Some officers barely spared him a glance, while others exchanged knowing looks. He wasn't just some random suspect, he was a name. A face people recognized. That made it a spectacle. He was placed in an interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The minutes stretched, turning into an hour. Then, the door opened, and Olivia Morgan walked in, heels clicking against the tile floor. She was a force of nature, sharp eyes, crisp blazer, and a presence that demanded attention. Behind her, a senior officer trailed in, looking wary. Mr. Diesel is leaving, Olivia announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. She tossed a folder onto the table. Unless, of course, you'd like to explain why you arrested a man without a single fingerprint on the so-called evidence? The officer hesitated, glancing at the report in front of him. Vin sat still, watching the interaction unfold. He had expected Olivia to handle it, but even he was impressed by the speed at which she dismantled their case. There was probable cause, the officer attempted. Olivia scoffed. There was a setup. That bag was planted, and you know it. She leaned forward slightly. Now, here's what's going to happen. Either you release my client immediately, or I call every major news outlet in the city, and we start discussing wrongful arrest, defamation, and abuse of power. The officer shifted, knowing exactly where this was heading. He exhaled sharply, then nodded to the officer at the door. Uncuff him. The metal came off as quickly as it had been put on. Vin rolled his wrists slightly but said nothing. Olivia turned to him. Let's go. As they stepped outside the station, the night air felt heavier. Jason Lee was waiting just outside, pacing near a lamppost. When he spotted them, he strode over. You okay? Jason asked. Vin gave a short nod. Fine. Olivia crossed her arms. This isn't over. They tried to make this stick. That means they're getting desperate. Jason's expression darkened. I've been digging. Holloway isn't working alone. There's a whole network inside LAPD covering for him. I've got names, but I need more time. Vin glanced back at the station, where Holloway still stood by the entrance, watching. He didn't look angry. He looked entertained. Vin turned back to Jason. Then we don't give them time. We move first. As they walked toward their cars, Vin's phone vibrated. A single text lit up the screen. You think you got away? The game's just getting started. Vin stared at the message for a long moment before locking the screen. He had expected retaliation. Now, he knew exactly how far they were willing to go. The city felt different at night. The hum of traffic, the flicker of neon signs, the distant sirens, it all blended into a familiar rhythm. But for Vin Diesel, something had shifted. The weight of what had happened at the police station still lingered. Holloway had made his move, and now it was Vin's turn. He sat across from Olivia Morgan and Jason Lee in the dimly lit back room of a small diner on the outskirts of downtown. The place was nearly empty, save for a lone cook behind the counter and an old man nursing a coffee near the window. It was safe. For now. We're not just dealing with one dirty cop, Olivia said, leaning forward, her voice low but firm. Holloway isn't working alone. If we want to take him down, we need to know who's backing him. Jason nodded. I've been digging into Holloway for over a year. He's got connections, high-ranking officers, old-school guys who have been running their own playbook inside LAPD for decades. Officially, they don't exist, but off the record, they pull the strings. Vin listened, his fingers tapping absently against the table. He already knew Holloway wasn't acting alone, but hearing it confirmed only deepened his resolve. Jason slid a folder across the table. There's more. 5 years ago, Holloway was involved in a police brutality case. A black man was beaten nearly to death during an arrest. The department said it was justified, said the suspect resisted. But there was a witness. Vin flipped through the pages. Newspaper clippings, internal reports, a name circled in red. Dante Lewis. Dante was supposed to testify. Jason continued. Then, the night before the trial, he disappeared. No trace, no body, just gone. Vin exhaled through his nose. And Holloway? Jason shook his head. He walked. The case fell apart without a witness. Olivia crossed her arms. If Holloway was involved, then there's a paper trail somewhere. But if we want to find it, we need someone who's been on the inside. Vin already had someone in mind. Marcus Reynolds had been a rising star in the LAPD before he made the mistake of speaking out. He had filed an internal complaint against a group of officers suspected of planting evidence. The case was dismissed. A year later, he resigned. No one had heard much from him since. Vin made the call. The voice on the other end was wary. Why are you looking for me? I need answers. Vin said. I think you know who I'm talking about. A long pause. Meet me at the old parking lot on Wilshire. Marcus said. Come alone. Vin didn't go alone. Jason insisted on coming. And Vin didn't argue. They arrived just past midnight. The lot was nearly empty. The glow of a single streetlight casting long shadows across the pavement. Marcus stood near a black sedan, his hands tucked into the pockets of his leather jacket. He looked older than Vin remembered, tired, like a man who had seen too much. This is a bad idea, Marcus said as they approached. You don't want to be here. Vin stopped a few feet away. I don't have a choice. Marcus let out a quiet laugh. That's what I thought, too. Look where it got me. Jason pulled out a notepad. We need to know about Holloway. Marcus studied them both, then exhaled. He's not just some racist cop throwing his weight around. He's part of something bigger. A network inside LAPD that's been running things their way for years. Drugs, weapons, cover-ups. They control it all. And Holloway? He shook his head. He's just a soldier. Vin's stomach tightened. Who's calling the shots? Marcus hesitated. There's a name that keeps coming up. But saying it out loud? He glanced around the empty lot, lowering his voice. That's how people disappear. Before Vin could press further, the night shattered. A gunshot rang out. Marcus staggered backward, a red bloom spreading across his chest. Vin lunged forward, catching him before he hit the ground. Jason cursed, scrambling for cover. Marcus gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. He gripped Vin's arm, his eyes wide with something between panic and resignation. Find him, he choked out. Don't let them win. Then his body went still. Vin lifted his head just in time to see a dark figure disappearing into the night. The message was clear. They were getting too close. Vin Diesel knelt beside Marcus Reynolds, pressing his hands against the gunshot wound. But deep down, he already knew it was too late. Blood soaked through Marcus's jacket, pooling beneath him on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. His breaths were ragged, shallow, each one more strained than the last. Jason stood frozen, his back pressed against a nearby car, eyes darting around the lot. The sound of screeching tires echoed in the distance. The black SUV was gone, disappearing into the maze of Los Angeles streets. Vin leaned closer as Marcus tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "Those bastards, LAPD," he coughed, the effort sending a shudder through his body. "Don't trust anyone." Then, with a final exhale, the light left his eyes. Vin's jaw clenched, his pulse pounding in his ears. Another man silenced, another truth buried. Jason let out a shaky breath. "We need to get out of here. Now." Vin didn't move right away. He took a second to close Marcus's eyes, then pushed himself to his feet. He wasn't just angry, he was boiling. This wasn't just about harassment or corruption anymore. This was murder. Jason grabbed his arm. "Vin, we have to go." Vin nodded. He didn't like running, but they had no choice. The moment sirens started wailing in the distance, they sprinted to their cars and took off in separate directions. Jason's voice came through Vin's phone a few minutes later. "I'm going underground for a while," Jason said, his voice tight. "They're watching everything. If I make too much noise now, I'll end up like Marcus." Vin gripped the wheel. "So what's the plan?" "I'll do what I do best. I'll dig." Jason's voice was filled with frustration. "I'll find out who's behind this. But I need time. And you? You need to be careful. If Holloway was willing to pull this, you're next." Vin didn't argue. He knew Jason was right. Holloway wasn't acting alone. There were bigger players in this game. Ones with power. Ones who thought they were untouchable. When Vin pulled into the back lot of Torx, Olivia Morgan was already waiting for him. She stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable, but her eyes burned with the kind of intensity that only came with years of fighting against a broken system. "Jason filled me in," she said before he could speak. "You need to get out of town." Vin frowned. "Not happening." Olivia's expression darkened. "Vin, listen to me. You are the target now. The police won't protect you. If anything, they'll be the ones coming for you. I don't run." "This isn't about pride," Olivia snapped, stepping closer. "This is about staying alive long enough to fight back. Do you even realize how deep this goes? Marcus was our only direct link. And now he's dead. You're next on their list." Vin exhaled slowly, steadying his breath. "That's exactly why I'm staying. If I leave, they win. I have to see this through." Olivia stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "Then at least let me set up some protection. I know people. Good people. We can keep you safe while we figure out our next move." Vin hesitated, then gave her a short nod. "Fine, but I'm not hiding." Satisfied, Olivia pulled out her phone and stepped away to make a call. Vin leaned against the hood of his car, staring at the darkened skyline. The city had always been alive, buzzing with energy, but tonight it felt different. It felt like something was closing in. By the time he drove home, exhaustion was starting to settle in, but his mind wouldn't rest. He kept replaying Marcus's last words. "Don't trust anyone." When he pulled into his driveway, something felt off. The porch light flickered. The air was too still. Then he saw it. His front door was ajar. The lock had been broken. Someone had been inside. Vin Diesel stood frozen at the entrance of his home, his muscles coiled with instinct. The doorframe was splintered, the lock barely hanging on. He reached behind his waistband, fingers curling around the grip of the compact pistol he kept hidden in a safe spot inside. Slowly, he stepped inside. The place was a mess. Furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor, cabinet doors left hanging open. This wasn't a robbery. This was a message. His gaze landed on the wall near the living room. The words were scrawled in thick red paint. "Stop while you can." Vin's fingers tightened around the gun. He knew Holloway was behind this. The man had gone from intimidation to outright threats. And this wasn't just about warning him anymore. It was a declaration of war. He moved carefully through the house, checking each room. Nothing was missing. No valuables. No electronics. But then he checked the security system. The red light on the camera feed was blinking. All the footage was gone. Whoever had broken in didn't just want to scare him. They wanted to erase any proof they had been there. Vin exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He needed backup. He grabbed his phone and dialed. Olivia answered first. Tell me you're somewhere safe, she said, skipping the pleasantries. My place was hit, Vin said. Whoever did it wiped my security feed and left a message on my wall. There was a short silence. Then, Olivia's voice was calm, steady. We can't report this. Vin already knew the answer. But he asked anyway. Why not? Because the people responsible are the ones who'd take the report. Jason's voice cut in a second later as he joined the call. Vin, listen to me. I've got a contact inside LAPD. Someone who doesn't play their game. But if we use him, we have to be smart. If Holloway finds out we're reaching out to one of their own, they'll move to shut us down. Permanently. Vin exhaled through his nose, trying to steady the anger simmering in his chest. We don't have time to play it safe. Olivia sighed. And if you push too fast, they'll make sure you don't get another chance. Vin paced the room, his mind running through their options. He couldn't stay here. If Holloway was escalating, this house was no longer safe. I'm leaving now, he said. He grabbed a bag, threw in a few essentials, then headed toward the door. But the moment he stepped outside, he stopped cold. Across the street, a police cruiser was parked in plain view. The engine was off. The street was quiet. Inside the car, in the driver's seat, sat Holloway. A slow smirk spread across the man's face as he lifted his phone, typing something out. A second later, Vin's phone vibrated. He didn't need to look. He already knew. You can't run. Vin's grip tightened around the phone. Then, suddenly, the street was no longer empty. Headlights flared to life. 1, then 2, then 3. More police vehicles, surrounding him, engines rumbling in the night. Vin stood in his doorway, pulse steady but mind racing. He had been expecting a fight. Now, it looked like it had come straight to his doorstep. Vin Diesel knew he had seconds to react. The moment the police cruisers roared to life, their lights flashing like a net closing in, his instincts took over. He wasn't going to stand there and let Holloway put him in cuffs, not when the game was rigged. He spun on his heel and bolted toward the back of the house. The moment he hit the fence, he leapt, gripping the top and pulling himself over in one fluid motion. As he landed on the other side, he heard the unmistakable crackle of a police radio. He's running. Move in. A siren wailed, cutting through the quiet neighborhood. Holloway wasn't just after him, he was making this a spectacle. Vin hit the pavement hard. Sprinting down the alley, he could already hear the distant screech of tires as officers moved to block off the surrounding streets. If he hesitated, they'd have him boxed in. He ducked behind a row of trash bins, pressing his back against the cold brick wall of an apartment complex. Footsteps pounded against the pavement nearby. Shadows stretched under the glow of a flickering street lamp. A voice barked an order. Sweep the area. He's close. Vin's pulse stayed steady. He needed an opening. Then, just as one officer turned the corner, Vin made his move. He shot out from his hiding spot, keeping low, and vaulted over a low wall, landing in an adjacent alley. The second he did, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Jason, you need to move now. Jason's voice was urgent. They're setting up roadblocks. Every exit out of the city is about to be locked down. Vin ducked into another alley, his mind already working. Tell me you have something for me. I've got a car waiting for you 2 blocks south. You need to get there before they do. Vin didn't waste time. He darted through the darkened streets, his breath controlled, his strides precise. He had spent years training his body for high-intensity moments like this, but this wasn't a movie. There was no stunt coordinator calling cut. By the time he reached the meeting point, a black sedan idled at the curb. The driver's side window rolled down. Jason sat behind the wheel, his face tense. Get in, Jason urged. Vin slid into the passenger seat, and the car peeled away from the curb just as another set of sirens flared in the distance. As they sped through the city, Olivia's voice came through on speakerphone. Holloway just put out a warrant for your arrest, she said, her tone tight with frustration. They're accusing you of resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. Vin let out a humorless breath. They're making it official. Jason tightened his grip on the wheel. They're making you the villain. It's all over the news. LAPD is framing this as a dangerous fugitive situation. If we don't get ahead of this, you're done. Vin stared out the window as they passed under a flickering streetlight. His face was on every TV screen in the city by now. People were already forming their opinions. They're setting the narrative. Olivia continued. Holloway just made a public statement. He's calling you a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. He didn't say what the investigation was about, but he didn't have to. The damage is already done. Vin clenched his jaw. He wasn't just running from Holloway anymore. He was running from the entire system backing him. Jason shot him a glance. So what's the play? Vin's gaze hardened. We find proof. We flip the script. The car disappeared into the night, leaving behind a city now convinced Vin Diesel was a criminal. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, Vin Diesel's face was plastered across television screens, news websites, and social media feeds. The official LAPD bulletin labeled him a fugitive. Accusations flooded the airwaves. Assaulting a police officer, resisting arrest, obstructing an ongoing investigation. The anchors spoke in measured tones. But the slant was clear. Hollywood actor Vin Diesel is now wanted by LAPD after reportedly assaulting a police officer during an attempted arrest last night. Sources within the department say he has gone into hiding, evading law enforcement. Authorities warn that Diesel should be considered dangerous. It was a lie, every word of it, but Vin knew the truth didn't matter. Not yet. He, Olivia, and Jason huddled inside a dusty, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place smelled of rust and old oil, and the only light came from a single exposed bulb flickering overhead. Jason paced near an old metal workbench, his phone in hand, scrolling through the headlines. They're eating this up, he muttered. Every major outlet is running with the story. LAPD is controlling the narrative. Holloway made sure of it. Olivia sat on a crate, arms crossed, her expression tense. You can't run forever, she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. If we don't flip this soon, they'll cement this image of you as a criminal. That's what they want. Vin leaned against the wall, arms folded, his jaw tight. He had spent his entire life building a career, a reputation, and in one night, Holloway had turned him into public enemy number one. Jason looked up. The problem is, we don't have proof. No video, no recordings, nothing concrete tying Holloway to the corruption. Right now, it's just our word against his. And you can guess whose side people are going to believe. Vin exhaled through his nose. He knew they were right. Running wasn't the answer. He needed to turn this around. Fast. Jason hesitated before speaking again. I might have something. Both Vin and Olivia turned to him. Jason pulled out his phone, swiping through messages. A source of mine. Former LAPD. He reached out this morning. Says he has information on Holloway. Real proof. Something that could change the game. Vin's eyes narrowed. Who is he? He won't give me his name. Too risky. But he agreed to meet us. Olivia frowned. Where? Jason hesitated. A bar just outside the city limits. Says it's safer that way. Vin felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't like it. It felt too convenient. Too easy. This could be a trap. He said. Jason nodded. I know, but if he's legit, this could be the break we need. Silence stretched between them. The tension was thick. Finally, Vin pushed off the wall. Let's go. The drive to the meeting spot was quiet. The hum of the engine the only sound. The city faded into darkness behind them as they crossed into the outskirts, where the neon lights of rundown dive bars flickered in the distance. The bar was small, tucked between a gas station and an auto shop. A battered neon sign buzzed overhead. Jason checked his phone. He said he'd be waiting in his car. Vin scanned the lot, his instincts on high alert. A lone sedan was parked near the far edge, its windows tinted. Something felt off. Vin exchanged a glance with Olivia. She nodded slightly. She felt it too. Slowly, they approached the car. Jason knocked on the driver's side window. Nothing. Vin tried the door. Unlocked. He opened it. And there, slumped over the steering wheel, was their informant. A bullet hole in his temple. Blood pooled on the seat. Jason cursed under his breath. Stumbling back, Olivia inhaled sharply, already reaching for her phone. Vin clenched his fists. They were too late. Vin Diesel didn't hesitate. The moment he saw the bloodied body slumped over the steering wheel, he lunged forward, checking for any sign of life. But it was useless. The man was gone. Executed before he could reveal what he knew. Jason cursed under his breath. Stepping back, Olivia, standing a few feet away, scanned the parking lot for any sign of movement. "We have to move," she said. Vin's hands instinctively searched the dead man's pockets, looking for anything, any clue, any lead. His fingers brushed against something hard. A small, smooth object. A USB drive. He slipped it into his pocket, his heart pounding. The moment was shattered by the distant howl of sirens. Jason's head snapped up. "They're here." Headlights flared in the distance. Multiple vehicles. LAPD. Vin knew what this was. They weren't here to investigate. They were here to clean up the mess. Holloway's mess. "Go," Olivia shouted. Jason sprinted toward a nearby car, yanking open the door. "Get in." Vin didn't hesitate. He and Jason dove into the vehicle just as the first police cruiser skidded into the lot. Tires screeched, lights flashed, and within seconds, more sirens roared to life behind them. Jason slammed on the gas, the car jerking forward onto the main road. Olivia peeled away in a separate direction, taking the USB with her. Vin twisted in his seat, watching as the swarm of LAPD cars fanned out. Some went after Olivia, but most were locked onto them. "We can't outrun them," Jason gritted out, gripping the wheel. "Then we outthink them," Vin muttered. The chase tore through the darkened streets. Traffic lights blurred past, horns blaring as Jason wove between cars, barely avoiding a collision. But LAPD wasn't backing off. More cars joined the pursuit, boxing them in. Then, ahead, a dead end. Jason cursed. "We're trapped." The squad cars screeched to a stop, forming a blockade. The officers spilled out, weapons drawn. Then came the slow, deliberate sound of a car door opening. Holloway. He stepped out, moving with the arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. His hand rested on his holster. But he wasn't in a rush. He wanted to savor this. He stopped a few feet away, shaking his head. "I told you, Diesel, you should have walked away." Vin's muscles coiled. "And let you get away with it?" Holloway smirked, drawing his gun. "I already have." His finger moved toward the trigger. And then his phone buzzed. Not just his. Every officer's radio crackled with an urgent transmission. Vin didn't know exactly what Olivia had sent out, but he could see it in Holloway's face, the shift from arrogance to confusion. Then rage. "Check your damn phones," Holloway barked. One of the officers hesitated, then slowly pulled out his device. The glow of the screen reflected off his face. His expression tightened. Another officer did the same. The video was spreading. Whatever was on that USB, Olivia had just unleashed it to the world. Public opinion was shifting, and so was the balance of power in that moment. Vin saw his opening. With a sharp movement, he lunged forward, slamming into Holloway before he could react. The gun clattered to the pavement. Holloway staggered back, but Vin didn't let up. He drove his fist into the man's gut. Then his jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. The officers tensed, uncertain now, torn between orders and the truth unraveling before them. Vin grabbed the fallen gun. For a moment, silence stretched. Holloway lay on the ground, blinking up at Vin, fury burning behind his eyes. Vin leveled the gun. He could end it right here. One pull of the trigger, and Holloway would never hurt another person again. The thought lingered. Then Vin took a slow breath, steady, controlled, and he threw the gun to the ground. Holloway's expression twisted with something between hatred and disbelief. Vin stared down at him. "You don't deserve an easy way out." Sirens wailed in the distance. More officers were arriving, but the energy had shifted. For the first time, Holloway looked unsure. Because now, justice wasn't in his hands anymore. The night air was thick with tension. The flashing lights of LAPD cruisers painted the scene in streaks of red and blue. Officers surrounded the lot, their hands hovering near their holsters, unsure of what to do next. Holloway lay sprawled on the pavement, a thin trickle of blood from his mouth, his face twisted in rage. Vin Diesel stood over him, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched from the fight. Then, from the crowd, a high-ranking LAPD officer stepped forward. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable. Everyone waited. Then Olivia's voice rang out, sharp and unwavering. "You all saw the video," she shouted, stepping forward. "You know who the real criminal is here." Some of the officers shifted uncomfortably. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Holloway, still on the ground, spat blood onto the pavement. Then, with a bitter smirk, he looked up at the commanding officer. "They're buying into a damn edited video," he scoffed, shaking his head. "You know this is a setup. Are you really going to take the word of a Hollywood actor over one of your own?" The officers hesitated. Vin took a slow breath, then stepped forward, locking eyes with the men and women in uniform. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't even about Emily. This is about every person who's been silenced. Every victim who never got justice. Every officer who was forced to look the other way." A beat of silence. Then, from the back, one of the younger officers hesitated, then lowered his weapon. "I won't be part of this," the officer muttered, shaking his head. One by one, others followed. Hands dropped from holsters. The line of blue fractured. The commanding officer took a slow breath, scanning the faces of his men. Then he nodded, his voice like steel. "Arrest him." For the first time, Holloway's expression changed. Two officers stepped forward, roughly yanking him to his feet. Cold steel snapped around his wrists. Holloway struggled, his face red with fury. "You're making a mistake," he shouted. "I'm not the only one. You think taking me down changes anything? The system is bigger than all of you." Vin didn't flinch. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Holloway could hear. "It has to start somewhere." Holloway's eyes burned with hatred. And then, just as the officers dragged him toward a waiting cruiser, he leaned in and whispered, "You think I'm the biggest fish in this pond? You have no idea how deep this goes." A chill ran down Vin's spine. Because for the first time since this started, he realized Holloway wasn't lying. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of Holloway's arrest, the media exploded. The leaked video had gone viral, triggering outrage across the city. News anchors dissected every frame, every word, exposing years of unchecked corruption within LAPD. "Shocking allegations tonight," one anchor reported, her voice steady but urgent. "New evidence suggests that Officer Rick Holloway's abuses were not isolated incidents. Sources indicate a deeper network of corruption within the department." The public response was swift. Protests erupted outside police headquarters. Calls for accountability echoed across social media. LAPD, under immense pressure, announced an internal investigation. Vin watched it all unfold from a small office in downtown Los Angeles, where Olivia and Jason were glued to their phones. "This is bigger than we thought," Jason muttered, scrolling through a long list of suppressed complaints. Holloway was just one piece of a much larger machine. Olivia, sitting across the table, sighed. "That's how it always works. One fall guy takes the hit while the real power stays hidden." Vin leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He should have felt relieved. Holloway was done. The public was awake. The system was being forced to confront its own rot. So why did it feel unfinished? Because of Holloway's last words. "You think I'm the biggest fish in this pond?" Vin sat up, rubbing his face. What if Holloway was right? Jason and Olivia looked at him. He was too confident. Vin continued. He thought he was untouchable. That means he wasn't acting alone. Jason exhaled, running a hand through his hair. If that's true, we're not just dealing with one bad cop. We're dealing with an entire system designed to protect itself. Olivia folded her arms. And if that's the case, they're already working on their next move. Silence settled between them. Vin had spent his life in front of cameras, playing roles, telling stories. But this wasn't a movie. There was no script, no director to yell, "Cut." There was only reality. And reality demanded a choice. He could walk away now, return to his life, let the legal system do what it would. Or, he could keep going. He could use everything he had, his influence, his resources, his voice, to push harder, dig deeper, and expose not just Holloway, but the entire network hiding behind him. Vin exhaled slowly. His decision was already made. He looked at Olivia and Jason. "We're not done." Olivia nodded, her eyes sharp with understanding. Jason smirked. "I was hoping you'd say that." The fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. The city was still burning with outrage. Rick Holloway was officially indicted. The headlines were relentless, dissecting every angle of his crimes. His mugshot was plastered across television screens, his arrogance replaced by a hollow, defeated stare. But Vin Diesel knew the real battle had just begun. Jason Lee had spent the last 48 hours working non-stop, digging into LAPD's history. His latest exposé was everywhere, an in-depth report linking Holloway to a clandestine group within the department. People think corruption is just a few bad apples, Jason muttered, rubbing his temples as he stared at his laptop. But this is systemic. His investigation exposed a network of officers who manipulated evidence, framed innocent people, and silenced those who spoke out. Holloway was just a foot soldier. Vin leaned over the table, scanning the names Jason had compiled. And the ones pulling the strings? Jason shook his head, still in the shadows. Across the room, Olivia Morgan was on the phone, pacing near the window. She was preparing for a hearing at City Hall, where she'd be testifying before a panel of officials. Some were eager for reform. Others wanted to bury the truth. Justice doesn't just happen, she had told Vin earlier. It has to be fought for. Over and over again. That truth settled uncomfortably in his chest. Later that evening, Vin found himself back at Torque's, sitting across from Emily Carter. The restaurant had reopened, though things still felt different. The weight of what had happened here lingered in the air. Emily stirred her tea, staring at the table. So, it's over, right? Vin hesitated. For the first time in days, he let himself really look at her. There was still exhaustion in her eyes, but also something else. Hope. A fragile kind of hope. The kind that could be shattered if he said the wrong thing. He wanted to tell her yes. That Holloway's arrest meant the end of it. That she'd never have to be afraid again. But he couldn't lie. Before he could answer, his phone vibrated. A text message. Unknown number. Vin opened it. May Da Ha Holloway. Nung May Se Kong Chom Duok Den Bon Dao. The knot in his chest tightened. He looked back at Emily, who was still waiting for his response. Vin forced a small smile. We're getting there. The city had quieted, but Vin Diesel knew better than to mistake silence for peace. Holloway was gone, arrested, indicted, stripped of his badge. His name had become synonymous with everything wrong in the LAPD. But was that enough? Jason Lee sat across from him in the dimly lit office. Stacks of papers spread out on the table. He hadn't stopped working. If anything, he was digging deeper than ever. There's more, Jason said, pushing a folder toward Vin. Holloway was just a soldier. The people giving orders? They're still out there. Vin flipped through the pages. Names, dates, financial transactions. It wasn't just the police, it was bigger than that. A system designed to protect itself. Olivia Morgan leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. You know what this means, don't you? Vin met her gaze. He knew. If you keep going, she continued, you're not just taking on corrupt cops. You're taking on powerful people. Politicians, businessmen, the kind of people who don't just play dirty, they don't lose. Vin exhaled slowly. She wasn't wrong. He could walk away now. Go back to Torque's. Let the justice system handle the rest. But then he thought of Emily. Of Marcus, the ex-cop who died trying to do the right thing. Of every victim whose story never made the news. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked to the door. Jason called after him. Where are you going? Vin didn't answer at first. He stepped outside, the city stretching before him, lights flickering in the distance. Then, pulling out his phone, he dialed. When Jason and Olivia followed him out, they heard his voice, steady and certain. We need to talk. I'm not stopping here. Justice isn't a destination. It's a battle that must be fought every day. Vin Diesel uncovered a truth bigger than he ever expected. But the question remains. How many more Holloways are still out there? How many systems are still protecting those who abuse their power? What do you think? Can true justice ever be achieved? Or will corruption always find a way to survive? Let us know in the comments below. And if you don't want to miss the next deep dive into stories of power, corruption, and those brave enough to fight back, make sure to subscribe to Covert Truths. Your support helps us bring more untold stories to light. See you in the next one.